Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Greetings. My guest for this program is Frank C. Feschino Jr. I've been looking forward to this interview for quite some time. Frank and I have been talking quite a bit on the phone in the last month or more, and we have arranged to make this interview happen. Frank Feschino is a graduate of the Pear College of Art in Hamden, Connecticut. He studied illustration, commercial art, photography. He was trained by several world-famous artists. I looked them up. They are indeed very, very prominent. Their names are Ken Davies, Rudolph Zallinger, and John Massimino. Frank earned his BFA. He studied film and video production after that, trained in Hollywood Steadicam operation, graduated with another degree, this one in film and video production. And you can see Frank's background in art, by the way, in his many, many excellent paintings and illustrations of his research. Frank became interested in UFOs in the early 1990s. He visited a relative's farm in Braxton County, West Virginia. Crop circles were appearing there. UFOs were being seen there. Frank very carefully, very meticulously documented those anomalies, shared his research with the famous British crop circle expert that was Colin Andrews, who actually used Frank's information in his World Crop Circle database. That got Frank off to the races because that's when he became aware of the famous Flatwoods Monster UFO crash of Braxton County that happened September 12, 1952. He was captivated. This became his life's work. I just want to add personally that Frank's dedication to this case is unrivaled by anyone else in the world. And frankly, I don't know of any other researcher who is equally dedicated to any one case the way that Frank is to this one. So it's an amazing thing. The case involved a downed UFO, alien occupant, 12-foot tall armor-clad being, and much, much more. Got a lot of press on radio and live television. And just what's interesting, as Frank pointed out, is that the show that it was broadcast on live TV called We the People had been a long-running popular TV show, was suddenly canceled after its Flatwoods Monster airing. And if you look up the TV show on Wikipedia, they don't bother to mention that fact. Anyway, there's much more to this case. We're going to talk about it. Frank has unpacked it all. It's astonishing. He covers this on his website. I would urge you to check out flatwoodsmonster.com, and especially in his book. This is the updated and expanded edition of his definitive work called The Braxton County Monster, the cover-up of the Flatwoods Monster revealed. There's more. Frank has much more going on, but you know what? We're going to bring him to the show. Frank Feschino, welcome to the Richard Dolan Show.
Glad to be on board, Richard.
Yeah, I've been so looking forward to this. And, you know, we got in touch after I did a very brief treatment of the Flatwoods Monster case because the History Channel has their TV show, Project Blue Book. And one of their episodes, of course, was the Flatwoods Monster case. I did a treatment of it on one of my live streams, and that got your attention. And I'm very, very glad we're able to do a in-depth analysis of this, plus all of the lead-up to it, which, as you point out, is very, very important. So can we talk a little bit about your interest in the Flatwoods and in 1952 in general? You've done a lot of work. In fact, you did another book called Shoot 'em Down, which is about the encounters in 1952.
Okay, Richard. The Summer of the Saucers in 1952 was at the point where the Flatwoods Monster incident occurred on September 12th, 1952. And during that time, there was 1,501 reported sightings, and 303 of them were unknown. And this year had more UFO reports to the ATIC than any other year in history, up to 69. Mm-hmm. Now, what first got my attention with the Flatwoods Monster case, I was visiting some relatives up in Braxton County, and there was a hotbed of UFO sightings over Braxton County, and I started talking to some of the locals of what was going on at that point, and they weren't too open about it, and I was an outsider being from Connecticut, and what really intrigued me was the way that the people actually responded to the words Flatwoods Monster.
How was
the
that?
The UFOs were basically seen up there quite often, and it was no secret. And that's when I found out about the Flatwoods Monster. Somebody said, you got to check out what was going on here in 1952. And that's when I started doing the backstory, and I'm like, there's more to this story than just a bunch of crazy hillbillies and a bunch of kids and some woman who saw a monster. So I started looking back, and that's when I discovered what was going on in 52. It was a hotbed for the whole country, not just over Flatwoods.
Well, what you find with the treatment of this case, it's really weird because it's really dismissed by so many people. It was certainly dismissed in the media. And even most people who try to research UFOs, I don't really think that they've taken it seriously. And this is something unique that you've done. You dove into it, and you found a lot.
Well, when the first time I ever met Stanton Friedman up in Gulf Breeze several years ago, right about the time I had started this, I told him at a conference that I was starting to look into this case, and I had interviewed the primary witness, Kathleen May, and I had interviewed Colonel Dale Levitt, who went up to the crash site in Flatwoods with his troops that night. And the first words out of Stanton's mouth, and I remember he looked at me behind the table, he says, "How did you get into those mountains?" He said, "We," speaking about the UFO community, he says, "we have been trying to get up there for years and been able to find out what happened up there."
Yeah.
And there was a good reason for it, because when this story hit the different news wires, it was made a big joke out of. Nobody believed it, and the people up there were just sick of all the jokes. And we could do a whole show on the jokes and everything I've heard, Richard, about downing the people up there, making idiots out of them. But I told them I had relatives up there, and they introduced me to some of the different people. And that wasn't just the beginning of it. I had to prove myself to these people in Flatwoods.
Right.
And what really opened my case up is when I got the Project Blue Book files, and I spent years going over them and deciphering and re-inking and trying to figure out what the heck had happened that night. And I remember bringing all these documents to Mrs. May, who was the primary witness involved, and I laid it all out on her dining room table. And she sat there and she looked at it with me. She said, "Frank, I had no idea it was this involved." And she ended up putting me in contact with other witnesses. Because even though I had relatives up there, it still wasn't easy, Richard, to get into the mountains. You know, I was definitely an outsider. And then I ended up interviewing the reporter, Ailey Stewart Jr., who was a Johnny on the spot. He was the first one of authority up there. And a lot of the other kids that were involved in this. But I had to prove myself to them, because over the years there were so many people that went up there on little covert missions, and reporters and people. And for instance, Freddie May, Kathleen's youngest son, he did a couple interviews, and he wasn't too happy with the way it turned out, because everybody goes back to the folklore tale. Where I had the power in my end of the court was I had the documents, and I actually used the Blue Book documents to my advantage and used them against the government, because I don't even think, honestly, that the government knew what happened that night. And when I started doing my research and putting my maps together and working with different retired military personnel, that's when it all pulled together.
I see.
When you see that master map. And actually, Flatwoods was the end of the story. Everybody just looked at Flatwoods and didn't look around what was going on north, south, east, and west. And that's where I started pulling the whole story together. I actually did the story in reverse, because once I realized that Flatwoods was the end of the night of what happened, I backtraced.
Right. No one else bothered to do this, Frank. This is a real contribution. So the first thing we can say relating to Flatwoods before we backtrack might be, you concluded that this was a landing, or actually even a crash of an object, definitely involving confrontations with the United States Air Force. And we can come back to that. The other thing I noticed when in your Blue Book examination, because you showed me a number of images from your research, was how in going through some of these Blue Book reports, you were able to decipher some very, very difficult to read text of witness accounts, and you were able to recreate, or at least some of the statements of these witnesses, who were, by the way, adamant that what they saw was not a meteor, that it was a controlled craft, and so forth. I thought that was quite impressive.
And once I started getting the expression, the bread trail,
yeah,
okay, the crumb trail, I started looking into different newspapers from throughout the United States. And I traveled to some of them in the West Virginia area. And then I would just write to different libraries throughout the United States. And once I started catching on to the trail, they would write back to me, and they would send me these articles. Then Stanton Friedman got hold of some of the files of Barry Greenwood, and he sent me more information. So I had literally hundreds of pages of pieces of information. And I started out by doing state maps. The master map that you see there, Richard, that's a conglomerate of everything. I started out with regional maps, then I expanded to state maps and started pinpointing everything. And then once I transferred everything onto that big master map, then that's when I got help from a couple military people, one in particular, and he just sat back and kind of explained, Frank, do you know what you really have? And I really didn't at the time, because I'm not military. But once I caught on to it, it became very easy to learn. And every time I did a radio show, people throughout the country, they would hear me, and I would say, go look in your local newspapers, because there were 10 states up and down the eastern seaboard where these UFOs were seen. And it just compiles. I'm still getting articles. My book has been outdated with new information. But it's connecting the dots, Richard, and then I'm able to go in between those dots and solidify the pattern.
Amazing. I don't think many researchers have ever gone through the level of meticulous research and detail investigation that you've done on this one particular case. It's really quite extraordinary, and a model, in fact, for how this can be done for a lot of UFO cases, it seems to me. But can we do some background then on the Flatwoods case itself? Because, as you were just saying, you started with Flatwoods, but then you had to backtrack because you realized there's a bigger story here. So can you talk about that bigger story? And that's really the story of 1952 and the shoot them down directive and policy that was in place, right?
Right. Well, actually, what piqued my interest and started getting me to look in reverse with the whole pattern of putting this whole story together was Ivan Sanderson, one of the original investigators, had actually written about this in his book Uninvited Visitors, except he didn't have it right. He was just going by some of the newspaper accounts in the Baltimore area, and he did a good Hail Mary, but he didn't come close because he didn't have the Project Blue Book documents at that point, and that's what I used. Right. And he was close, but just didn't get it. But that's actually what got me rolling when I saw there was stuff going on in other parts of the country. And then I started looking into the Project Blue Book case files. I ordered the microfilms, and I started going through all the July sightings and what was going on. And that's when I figured out through a quote that Edward Ruppelt had given, there have been more lurid duels of death in reference to the fighter pilots that were killed. And that really piqued my interest. And I called Stanton Friedman up, and he said something to the effect, I read that book before you were born, Frank, and I never even picked up on that quote, the lurid duels of death. Right. So anyways, I started looking into the cases a little bit deeper. I pulled out all the Project Blue Book files, and I started looking about how many different cases had involved interactions between jets and UFOs, flying saucers. And there was a dozen of them that had occurred that I found between jets. Another one was a prop plane. But anyways, I started looking a little bit further into this and discovered how many lost pilots there were that had disappeared over the United States, and I wrote about that and Shoot 'em Down. And I started tying all of this stuff together, Richard, with what was going on, and in the long run, I was able to establish on the night of the Flatwoods Monster event, there were 4 different UFOs that came in over the United States, 3 over the mid-Atlantic eastern seaboard, damaged. 1 came from the direction of Florida, and they all headed inland in the direction of Flatwoods. And they were all making multiple landings. Pieces were falling off of them. They were flying at treetop level, making erratic maneuvers, exploding in the air. And these UFOs were seen by thousands of people. And I really didn't have any idea of how big this story was until I started reading some of the Project Blue Book documents. And that's what you brought up earlier, is some of the comments and descriptions of the UFOs that the people were describing. Then I would go back and look in all the Washington area papers and the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic papers, and there were different articles written about the sightings as well. And what I did is I dissected all the information and pulled it out. I even got to the point where I was trying to decipher the different amount of UFOs through the sightings and flight path trajectories. And once I was able to establish that, I did paintings of each one of them. And my house looked like a UFO flying saucer museum. This took years. And I lined them all up and hung them up around the house. And then I looked at the different flight paths, and I was able to connect the dots like, wow, this one was seen over here, then it was seen over there, and this one was seen there. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, I would like to go into some detail on some of these things that you've mentioned, if you don't mind. Can I back you up and ask you about the deaths of the pilots, or the missing pilots that you referred to a little while ago? That's just backing this up again before we get to Flatwoods. What was the context of this? I don't think most people are aware of what you're talking about here in Ruppelt's statement about these chases, and you wrote a whole book about it, and I think it would be a good idea just to get into a little more detail so that people can understand just how dramatic this was.
What I did, Richard, is I used the New York Times as my database, and I spent years going through the New York Times articles. I started in 1951, and it brought me up to 1956, and the title in the Shoot 'em Down book was called The 6 Deadly Years. And what I did is I extracted all this information out, I separated it all, and followed all the consistencies and inconsistencies of what was written in the articles. And long story short, I was able to find out that there was 205 fighter aircraft accident incidents where aircraft were destroyed. And out of the 205, 188 of them were over the United States, and the other 43 were around the world. Mm-hmm. And the 100 of the 181, I'm drawing back on memory, the non-trainers fighters destroyed over the United States were only 7. Okay, so we have actually, of the 205 incidents, Richard, we have 200 fighter pilots and radar operators, which were basically in the 2-man Cedar jets. They sat in the back. There were 200 of them that were killed.
Now, do you know that this was in relation to encounters with UFOs, or are there other reasons for this?
No, I just wanted to see what was going on over the United States during that time, and a good chunk of these were all mysterious.
I see.
Vanished planes. Actually, 19 of them vanished over the United States, just disappeared into thin air. There were instances where there would be a squadron out, one would blow up in the air, one would crash, one would run out of fuel, one would, it was just crazy things going on. One instance, a couple, these were Marine aircraft, flew into a cloud, and the wingmate was contacting the lead guy, and right in the middle of while they were talking, once they came out of the clouds, the guy was gone. The jet just disappeared in a matter of seconds. Just crazy stories like that were going on. And what I found interesting, and especially working with fighter pilots, that during of these 205 accidents, Richard, 67 did not bail out, which is very odd. And
Yeah,
I
that
remember,
is.
Pardon?
That is odd, because you would think they would know that there's a problem, and pilots are trained in ejection procedures. Obviously, they know when there's an issue, get out of the plane, and they're able to do it most of the time. And yet, that's a lot, 67.
Yes, 67 of them.
And there were certain cases of definite encounters with UFOs in these, weren't there?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Absolutely. So,
What's interesting here is, out of all those cases, there were 13 multiple jet crashes. There were 13 cases where between 2 and 4 jets all went down at the same time, and the majority of them said they had run out of gas. They all ran out of gas together.
yeah, that's not very
Which is
credible.
absolutely ridiculous.
Not credible, right? Not at all.
Yeah, it's just the statistics go on and on and on. But one of the interesting points is over the United States between 51 and 56, 35 airmen vanished over the United States just into thin air and were never found, and 7 over foreign countries. So we have 42 airmen who just vanished into thin air.
It's incredible. It's
Yeah,
really an
never found.
unknown history, and it's great that you've kind of unpacked that for everyone. And this is, of course, concurrent with the UFO engagements that pilots were having, and the explicit order to engage in these objects given by the U.S. military. I wonder if you can talk about that.
Well, let me jump into one little thing, Richard. I'm going to show you the magnitude of these. Just were, guys who had just got their wings. These were not rookies by any means. In those cases there, Richard, there were the 9 top veteran combat flyers, okay, combined for 885 total combat missions between World War II and Korea.
Wow.
885, and these 9 guys all died mysterious deaths.
That's incredible.
And 4 of them were aces.
Yeah, that's inexplicable.
And these guys are just disappearing, dropping out of the sky. It's just crazy. We could do a whole show just on these fellas right here. But the whole point of this is that we have the shoot 'em down orders that took place in the summer of 1952.
Right. Yeah, and this is, I think, contentious in our public to this day, because again, I don't think that people are aware of just how dramatic the UFO phenomenon had become, the flying saucers had become by 1952. And, I was just talking with you before we began recording about the story of the Canadian researcher Wilbert Smith. And Smith was very well known to American researchers. He was a Canadian government official, an extremely intelligent man who was deeply involved in communicating with the Americans all through the 50s on the UFO phenomenon. And at the end of his life, in 1962, he was dying. He was visited by a couple of researchers who were asking him things, and he let out that he had held in his hand a piece of a crashed or a piece of a flying saucer. And they were incredulous. He said, yes, absolutely. And he told them that it had been a part of an object that was shot down over Washington in 1952. They said, well, what happened to that piece? He said, well, I had to give it back. Where did it go? The CIA? He said, much higher than that. They continued to ask, and he said, look, you're going to have to look into this yourselves, gentlemen. And that was really all he said. Shortly after that, he died. So that's Wilbur Smith's account. That's pretty much in line with a lot of the research you've been doing, isn't it?
Yes. Well, one of the main things here that caught my eye was an International News Service article, Richard, and it was on the 29th of July, 52, and the headlines read, Air Force orders jet pilots to shoot down flying saucers if they refuse to land.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'm going to quote this for your listeners. The jet pilots are and have been under orders to investigate unidentified objects and to shoot them down if they can't talk them down.
Right.
So there was a lot of stuff going on. There were scrambles basically every day. And, we could talk about the Cold War involvement, and you could probably do a week-long lecture on that, the tie-in of how the country was frantic, expecting the Soviet Union to attack. And so they were basically scrambling out after anything and everything.
There was a lot of concern, without a doubt. The U.S. military, the intelligence community. I don't think anyone was actually thinking, "Oh, well, this is the Russians with some unknown technology." But they were concerned. At least some of them were concerned that the confusion that could result over all of these reports of flying saucers in 1952 could jam communication so much so that if there were an actual Soviet initiative of some sort, that the Americans wouldn't be able to respond because of all of this. So there was that concern. But then there always, in my view, had to be concern by the Americans over these flying saucers themselves. I mean, it's not simply being worried, oh, they're going to confuse us if the Russians do something. I mean, these objects themselves were a great concern, and our jet pilots chased after them and were lost at times chasing after them. And I know that in your research, you found cases of this. And in fact, you looked into one in great detail. And I hope that we're able to talk about that.
All right, Richard, an interesting point here with the missing fighter pilots and all the research I did tied me into an incident that happened down here off the coast of Florida, just west of MacDill Air Force Base. It was an F-94 Starfire jet that vanished into thin air right before it all hit the fan and went north up the Flatwoods.
So what date are we talking about here, Frank?
This was September 12th, 52.
Yeah,
the
same
day, just about an hour and 20 minutes before everything went down up in the mid-Atlantic. This happened down in Florida.
Yeah, this is quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, same date, almost the same time. We have a very interesting mystery that you're about to describe. Go on.
Well, we have and I spent years researching this case, and it was actually more mysterious, Richard, than the Flatwoods case itself, because Flatwoods was well known. This case was long and forgotten years ago. Well, I actually found out about it from a News Journal article here in Daytona Beach.
Mm-hmm.
I was scouring through and I was looking up the September 12th incidents, and it was actually it was a couple days later by the time I hit the AP wires, but they did talk about the UFOs that were seen up over the mid-Atlantic area, and the Daytona paper carried it. And as I was skimming through the microfilm, I found a incident where an F-94 Starfire from Tyndall Air Force Base, which is in Panama City, actually vanished into thin air. And that really caught my attention, and I started going full bore onto this case. And I was given the run around by all the different Air Force bases. I mean, I lost track how many I contacted. But long story short, Richard, at the time I wrote my first book, which was published in 2004, there was nothing on planet Earth that had any record of the pilot or his radar operator.
So that not only did the pilot disappear, but all records seemed to disappear.
Everything.
Well, that's interesting.
There was no Social Security death index, nothing. They were never in the Air Force. I had written the Air Force twice. They had no record of the incident. And I called Kirtland Air Force Base, and I wasn't greeted too courteously by the fellow I spoke to about the case, to put it mildly.
Uh-huh.
But honest to God, he said to me, "How did you find out about this case?"
Wow.
I said, I found it in a newspaper article. And Richard, what God is my witness, I'm not kidding you. He said, "You mean to tell me that you have a newspaper from 1952? When I said September 12th, 52 to this fella I was talking to, it was like saying December 7th, 1941.
Wow.
His interest just peaked. And then he started talking to me about how it's expensive it's going to be to do research with the Air Force and blah, blah, woof, woof, all this kind of junk. And I just ended it right there. And I didn't pursue it any further. Then I contacted Maxwell with Kirtland. Then I contacted Maxwell Air Force Base, sent them a couple letters. They had no records of this incident
Even
whatsoever.
though it was reported in the newspaper. That's what got you started on this.
Right. And then I contacted other newspapers throughout the state of Florida, and they were all interested in this, and they were working with me pretty close on it. And I'm getting, I got about a dozen different articles about this case. And what I did is I put all the information together. I worked with a couple military guys, and we did a timeline from what was reported in the press conferences. And once I put this timeline together, it didn't make sense. There was too much missing.
Now you're saying the timeline of the F-94's mission?
Yeah, the mission and what was said, what happened. You know, it was just a mess. It was an absolute cover-up from the get-go, and I knew that right off the bat. From there, I contacted the surviving brothers of John Anderson Jones Jr., who was the F-94 pilot, and John Del Curto, whose brother was in Oregon. And I contacted the brothers, and interestingly, the pilot's brother only lives about 25 minutes away from me here in Florida, where I live in Daytona area.
Okay.
Another coincidence. And he actually contacted me back a couple days later, Richard, and he says, Frank, I was digging around up in the attic, and I have the Air Defense Command Western Union, and I have the government documents, the letters that were written to me.
How about that?
Disappeared. Yeah, Richard, I almost keeled over. He sent me copies of them, and at that point I said, do you know there's no record of your brother being born, never dying? There's nothing. There's no Air Force records. And he got kind of upset over it.
Sure.
He was teed off. And then he sent me everything, and I went through all the articles, the press release articles from the spokesman at MacDill and Tyndall, where the flight originated from. Then I combined it with all the Western Union telegrams. And the Tyndall, there was a Tyndall document from the big wig up there. So anyways, I put all of this together and I form another timeline. None of it makes sense. Two different stories. Okay, we had the press releases, then we have what was told to the family, because the fella in Oregon, the radar operator's brother, he received the same telegrams.
Right, there were the two
when I got
men.
him, I read them. He says, yeah, they just changed the names. But anyways, you know.
Yeah,
so now we have two different timelines that make no sense at all. Then when that was released in 2004 in my book, all of a sudden, a few months later, all the documents come out from the Air Force. Stan Friedman called me up and he says, Frank, the documents have been released. And I'm like, really? Well, it's the aircraft accident report, and it was 68 pages long and heavily edited. And the preliminary report was missing out of it. And luckily, Stanton was in Washington, and he went to the archives at that point, and he was actually routing and digging around on his hands and knees looking through September 12th paperwork. Yeah. And he found a preliminary report that was missing from the microfilm, was mixed and jumbled in with the September 12th documents.
Okay, and what did that say?
Very heavily edited. Mm-hmm. And the thing that hit me about this whole case is the radar operator's name was not brought up once in any of the reports.
You're saying the radar operator was just eliminated from the reports themselves?
Completely, and he was the radar operator. He's one of the key guys that steered the jet. There wasn't even a damn word about him in the whole thing. Richard, when I put that timeline together, it took me 3 years. It was between 60 and 70 foot long in timeline going through my house. I dissected all the information out, and I worked with Air Force guys, and we laid all this information out. I got a guy who was a former pilot. He actually sat in my house. He put 2 chairs from the living room, one in front of the other. He says, "Frank, I'm the pilot, you're the radar operator," and we recreated this whole thing over again.
Wow.
Richard.
Well, can you
So
give us the timeline?
now we have 3 timelines, and none of them make any sense. So what I had to do is take all 3 of these timelines and put all of them and squish them all together.
How does that timeline look? Because I'm dying to know it. I think listeners are dying to know what actually happened to that F-94
It was
flight.
actually a disgrace of what the Air Force had said. I went through, and there was 2 Air Force meetings up at Tyndall Air Force Base, and I actually write a whole chapter on all the inconsistencies of what happened, Richard. It was an absolute disgrace, and they blamed it in the long run on pilot error. And these fellas were actually being tracked by 3 Air Force installations in voice communication when they vanished into thin air.
They're being tracked by 3 installations when they vanished. That had to be a very important mission indeed.
Yes, and the biggest radar at the time was at MacDill, where this jet was supposedly flying to after leaving Tyndall. But once it departed out of Tyndall, it went into the northeast direction over Moody and with a group of other planes, and it got lost, and it came back. It refused to land, took back off over the panhandle of Florida low on fuel, according to the Air Force, which is from me trying to drive to your house on a quarter tank of gas. It ain't going to happen. But nobody ever figured it out. Stanton helped me figure out the gas estimates and how much, the consumption, and all that ball of wax. So anyways, this jet is going on low fuel across the Gulf of Mexico, being tracked by the biggest military radar at the time at Tyndall. It was called Homer. They were being tracked by Tyndall, Moody Air Force Base in Valdosta, and it disappeared into thin air in a heartbeat.
Okay, so the real question then is, what was actually happening, Frank? Why was the jet dispatched? Why was it such an important mission that it was being monitored by so many Air Force installations? What was going on?
Well, they said it was a routine weather training mission, and they were
but
recalled.
That's not what happened. So what do you say what happened?
Oh, they were definitely in confrontation with a UFO.
Right. So let's talk about that.
Because what happened, Richard, because we could talk for a week about this, but when I got the original documents from the Air Force, the aircraft accident report, all the points and plots on the map going from point A, which is Tyndall, to MacDill Air Force Base, point B, it disappeared about 70 miles off the coast in communication. When I retracked and I cross-referenced all the points, what the jet actually did is when it was closest to landing and it was coming into MacDill Air Force Base, and one of the guys told me that's what they call when you put your wheels down, you're ready to get home, the jet turned around and flew in the other direction and did a U-turn, then did another U-turn and came back. And that's what everybody missed. Nobody had any idea what was going on. And me and my guys were able to figure this out. So this thing was actually flying around in a circle, chasing something.
The jet was,
and when it made its second turn and made a U-turn and came back, that's when it vanished.
Now, you did a great deal of investigation of this pilot, and in fact, you really got very into the pilot's head and persona, it seems to me. You tracked down his grave.
Yeah, the family, especially the surviving brother, he was upset when I told him all of this.
Yeah.
He was very upset because the family wasn't even... John disappeared, the pilot disappeared on late Friday afternoon, and the family wasn't contacted until Monday.
Yeah, horrible.
Which is kind of irritating, and I said, were you aware it took that many days until they realized that your brother was vanished, he disappeared? And he says, Frank, honestly, he said there was so much going on dealing with his sister and people in the family. We were heartbroken. He says, I really didn't even look at it like that. And the sad part about this is, Richard, that talking to him, over a bit, he told me the biggest disappointment was down in Florida here. They're always finding missing planes and jets in the woods and the swamps and off the coast and everything. And he says, and every time there was a plane that was found or unearthed or pulled out of the water, him and, the family would sit around praying, and they were hoping it was John's jet, and they never found it. The jet is gone, and it disappeared over shallow water, too.
Just awful. Frank, can you just give the proper context for this pilot, John Jones, and his radar men, why they were scrambled, why they were lost? Because in your research, something very, very important was going on along the whole eastern U.S. seaboard, and I really would love for you to explain to people just what that was, and because this is something that you and you alone uncovered.
Well, what I found out, Richard, by researching everything of what happened at September 12th, there was approximately 21 hours of UFO sightings throughout the United States. This incident here in Florida actually was the beginning of everything that went down that night. And these fellows were scrambled after UFOs. They were zapped. They vanished. These UFOs that were involved in this confrontation with Jones and Del Curto, I actually traced them going up the eastern seaboard and across the central part of the United States, up the mid-Atlantic portion, and these UFOs actually flew into the Flatwoods area. About the same time as this one from the south flew up, and it was damaged. These guys hit it. It was definitely damaged. It was making repeated landings throughout the United States. Now, it flew into the Braxton County area. About the same time, off the eastern seaboard, the mid-Atlantic portion of the United States, 3 UFOs came in damaged one after another. They were all in flames. They were making repeated landings. They were seen by thousands of people. The first UFO came in, and it flew northwest. And I was able to trace it going down into the area of Oak Ridge.
Okay, I want to stop you right there. I just want to back up so
Right.
people understand. This is important. These objects, you said, appeared, and the impression that I got from you is that the U.S. military was ready or waiting for them. Is that accurate?
Oh, absolutely
Yeah.
right.
And
That's
they,
a good observation.
Right. And
they were absolutely
they
ready for it.
appeared in the Atlantic Ocean off the U.S. coast, correct?
Yes, and
Right.
they were situated in the no-fly zone, the air defense identification zone of the Atlantic Ocean.
Can you identify approximately where they appear, like most closely off what coast, where they were?
What I did, remember I told you earlier, Richard, I worked with a couple Air Force guys, and we worked in reverse.
Right.
When I had all the plotted points and timestamps of these UFOs, we connected these dots to 3 of them coming from the west and traced them all going back east.
Mm-hmm.
And they all intersected 90 miles off the coast of the United States, directly across from Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Directly across from Washington.
So in the east, in the Atlantic Ocean, but fairly close to D.C.
Yeah, 90 miles off the coast.
That's where they appeared. U.S.
And an no-fly
jet fighters.
zone, and they each came in damaged. The first one flew southwest, and it flew over the United States, and it flew approximately 100 miles through the Oak Ridge National Laboratory no-fly zone. Try doing that today.
No, right.
Or
Well,
even back then.
unless
It
someone
penetrated the airspace where it wasn't supposed to be.
If someone is skeptical of this, I just want to point out one of the bits of research you undertook was to talk about how the fighter jets in 1952, I think you're talking about the F-8060 Saberjet, the F-94C Starfire, and one of the Navy planes, the F-7 U-3 Cutlass, had computerized and rockets attached to them that I believe you are arguing were used against these objects. Is that accurate?
Oh, most definitely.
Right.
They were carrying folding fin aerial rockets. They were 2.75-inch rockets, and they had a 7.5-pound warhead.
Right.
And they had a maximum range of about 6,500 yards, an effective range of 3.5 miles. And basically, these three jets, the F-86D, the F-94C, and the Cutlass, they were all carrying these rockets. And these aircraft had computers on board. And for instance, the F-94C, which was the first model, that had 1,200 pounds of electronic equipment and an onboard computer. And basically what they would do, I talked to a guy who flew one of these things, and the pilots weren't too up on what they can actually do, but they could basically take their hands off of the steering stick, and they would put it on automatic, and the Starfire would actually follow the target. And it could be like a roller coaster if the UFO was moving very erratic, and it was just these guys were along for the ride, and the computer would pick the precise point and fire the rockets.
That's pretty amazing, particularly for 1952. I don't think most people would be expecting that the military had that capability, but they did. That's amazing.
Yeah, and it actually calculated the exact moment for the rockets to fire, and then it would salvo them.
And so these were being used actively against flying saucers invading U.S. airspace. This was the shoot them down policy that was in effect. And what you're saying, what your research indicates, is that this is exactly what happened on September 12th, 1952. In the case of,
would that be a surprise to the UFOs who were being shot at with bullets? And then all of a sudden, these aircraft look basically the same, except they're coming in and now they're carrying rockets.
Right. Exactly. So with that in mind...
I said this before once a long time ago in a lecture, and it would be like a bunch of kids in kindergarten. They all got look-alike little water pistols. And then all of a sudden, the kids walk into class one day and they got a real gun.
Right.
The rockets are going to be a lot more effective than those bullets are. And what a surprise that would be to UFOs who, and you know, Richard, they were basically playing cat and mouse with our aircraft over the years. They were just checking them out and testing to see how close they could come in, where the bullets would drop off, how fast they could go, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. And then bang, here basically overnight, here's all of these aircraft coming in with computers on board carrying rockets.
It's almost like a new milestone in the military confrontations with these unknown objects that took place in 1952. And as a result of that, there was obviously something going on where several of these were dropped off the coast of Washington, D.C. in September 1952. American jets were ready or waiting for them and attacked and engaged them and shot them and damaged them. And then these objects moved west across the United States and in different directions.
The interesting point, Richard, is we know Keogh did research back in the 40s and 50s about key government installations and atomic plants and Air Force bases where UFOs were seen over for years. Well, it was no coincidence that this first damaged object that came in was making a beeline, and it was gunning for Oak Ridge National Laboratory. The second one that came in a few minutes later went northwest, and it was targeting and going directly at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Directly at it. If you look at the master map, you can see it. It's amazing. The third object that came in made a beeline and went directly over Washington, D.C., and that was actually the Flatwoods Monster craft. And I tracked that coming directly over Washington, and that is where the New York Times talks about the article the following day, the flame over Washington.
Is this the same one as over Baltimore? There was a lot of different coverage of these objects that night. They were all treated primarily as separate incidents, but obviously these are all related.
They told everybody that they saw a single fireball meteor.
Yeah.
The one I went over Baltimore was the one that headed up towards Wright-Patterson.
I see. Okay.
You know, so we have three objects basically coming in. It was like a triad. And the third one that came over Washington. Now, what's interesting is by using the time stamps, Richard,
Right.
the first one that was in Tennessee and the second one that was gunning up towards Wright Pat, when the flame over Washington came directly over Washington, and it was seen by thousands of people. The people were out. It was actually hot that day. It was an Indian summer. People are outside driving in their convertibles, walking their dogs, pushing their kids in the strollers, and they're looking up and they're seeing this thing come treetop level over Washington. That was what you referenced. This thing was being flown, one of the witnesses.
I see, yeah.
Well, when this thing flew over Washington and just passed west of D.C. and was not intercepted, the other two objects turned away. The timestamps all bring that together, and that's amazing. They were actually gunning and putting the heat on those two installations, and the second the third one came in, wasn't taken down. The other two turned and went reverse, and then I tracked them over about 30, 40 locations.
So what were they doing, and where did they end up? What ended up happening to those?
The one that flew down into the Tennessee area, that actually backtracked, and what happened is when it landed, it set off a search and rescue by the local area. There was ambulances sent there. There were seen flares, what were said to be flares going off. And by the time the local police and the ambulance and the fire department, everybody was there, the thing had taken off already, and I traced it going back south and leaving the United States. The other one,
it basically got away.
It got away.
Right.
But basically, the way it was explained to me, and this is the easiest way that it was put to me in layman's terms, it's like in a street fight. The first one that came down, there's the kick to the crotch. The second one that was up towards Wright Pat, there's your head shot. The third shot is the heart shot. That's the one that knocked him out. And that came down over Washington. So you have 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
It's like, hey, look, check out what we're going to do.
Got it.
You don't have the balls to stop us. Fuck you. We're going and we're going to crash into Oak Ridge, and we're going to land right in the heart of Wright-Patterson. And if you don't like it,
Right, gotcha.
So when the third one came down unscathed, they took the heat off. They were putting the pressure on, Richard.
Okay.
That's military strategy.
I see what okay, I get it now.
The third one that came in was the most damaged one, Richard. And that thing could have been taken out. That was the Flatwoods Monster craft. That thing was really f***ed up.
Okay.
And that had pieces falling off of it. It was seen by everybody in Washington. It was seen over Virginia. And it took about a half an hour for it to fly from Washington all the way into Flatwoods, and we were able to figure out it was actually flying about 400 miles an hour. The government said it was a meteor. If it was a meteor, it would have reached Flatwoods in about 7 seconds.
Right, absolutely.
Not 25 to 30 minutes.
So this is actually a really good overview of the whole. Really, this is the prequel to the famous Flatwoods Monster case. And I'm glad that we did this because it gives at least more of a proper background to the whole incredible story that most of us, we've learned, has been taken completely out of context from what was happening. And not only out of context, but really misrepresented, totally misrepresented. And I'm just so glad that you were able to do the kind of background investigation that you did, and all of the meticulous, just putting everything on a map. And with fortunately, you got a lot of help doing it. And the result is you've provided a much, much more complete story of this whole thing.
Well, here's a key part, Richard. I live near Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. That's one of the biggest aeronautical libraries in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that was basically my home away from home. I spent years researching that library. It took about 10, 12 minutes for me to get there. They thought I was a student. I was there so much. And I was going through all their old archives and microfilms and microfiche and books, and I was talking with professors and pilots, and everybody was very helpful over there at Riddle. And one of the guys who helped me put my master map together, this is kind of funny, and I could see what he was talking about now back in the early days. He said, Frank, what I want you to do is go over to Riddle, because when I started this research, it was, no internet, Richard. I had to do it the old-fashioned way like you did in the old days.
That's right.
And he said, I want you to figure out, and he gave me a list of planes. He says, and your homework assignment is you come back and you tell me what the armaments on every one of these planes were. And I want the stats on them and blah, blah, blah. And finally, when I got everything done, and I found out the ones that were the rocket-bearing aircraft, I'm like, why didn't you just tell me this right off the bat? I spent weeks and months over researching all of this. He says, because when you do radio shows, he says, you got this embedded into your head.
Which you do.
He says, what you do. He says, if I had told you, it's like, okay. He says, but now you've read 100 books about these aircraft. And then when the internet did come into existence and I had access to it, I was able to find more stuff out. Yeah. You see some of the photographs and the pictures, and it was pretty scary. Actually, the 2.75-inch rocket, somebody brought one. It was disarmed, of course. When I was at the Charleston Civic Center, we had a dummy one. And there's a picture of me in my recent book standing there holding the rocket.
Fascinating.
It's quite amazing, yeah. You could imagine. Now, these things were, they were not guided. And the way it was explained to me is once these things hit the wind, these things would be like, Richard, you ever put a bunch of bottle rockets in a Coke bottle and light them all off at once when you were a kid? Go crazy in different directions. Well, that's what these rockets did.
Right.
So they were kind of hard to predetermine what the hell direction they were coming at you. Because they would come in like a curveball, a knuckleball. They would come in sideways. And they went in all different directions. So you can imagine a sky filled with hundreds of these rockets aimed at UFOs. The UFOs, it would have been hard for them to avoid. The rockets didn't even know where they were going.
Fascinating.
So you get a few hundred of these rockets decorating the sky and shooting and hitting these UFOs. Then we have 3 of them coming in over the eastern seaboard, and they all had specific areas that they were actually going for. And the one that went over Washington, D.C. flew about 200 miles west, and that's the one that flew into Braxton County.
So, Frank, I think that's going to be all for this segment, because I want to jump into the Flatwoods case. We're going to take that as like the next and really fundamental part of talking about the Flatwoods Monster itself. What was this monster? Well, it was a non-human extraterrestrial is really what it was. You've got a lot of description of it. And then also, I think after we open that whole thing up, we want to talk about the Framewood case as well, which was just very nearby Flatwoods. And most folks do not know about that one. It's quite interesting as well. But we'll do all of this in time. And your investigation of the Flatwoods case and how you learned all of what you did and what actually happened. Quite amazing. Let's wrap it up for now. I just want listeners to know, once again, if they are interested in Frank's work, they can go to your website, which is flatwoodsmonster.com. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
And there they can find your books on the subject, your research, and it's quite fascinating. So, Frank Feschino, thanks very much for this segment of our interview on The Richard Dolan Show.
Glad to be here, Richard.
You bet. And I want to thank you for listening. And remember, while we learn and grow and search for the truth, let's be good to each other. Later.